Good evening, welcome to Story Time. Tonight I'm reading The Iceberg Hermit by Arthur Roth. The Iceberg Hermit by Arthur Roth. Chapter 1. "Masthead there! Look sharp! Blast ye eyes!" the captain roared. High on the lookout point on the main mast, 17-year-old Alan Gordon steadied himself and looked down. The captain and the first mate, two black dots far below on deck, were looking up at him. Alan watched the captain turn to the first mate and say something. Then angry voices rose again on the still cold air. All around him, Alan could hear ice scraping against the wooden sides of the Ann Forbes. He blew into his mittens, trying to warm his hands. The fog seemed to get inside his clothes, making him shiver. He put his hand into the pockets of his jacket and felt the small Bible his mother had given him when he left home. She had made him promise to read a page every day. So far he had only missed once, the day they had caught their first whale. In all the excitement, he had forgotten his promise, but he had read 2 pages the next day to make up for it. Alan had long ago decided that Captain Hughes was a liar and a bully. He shouted at everyone on the ship. Only Big Tom, the first mate, would stand up to him, but the other men, and Alan too, kept quiet when the captain began to rant and rave. Captain Hughes was the sort of man who was looking for any excuse to place a sailor in irons for mutiny. That way the captain and the ship owners would have one less share to pay out when the ship reached Aberdeen, its home port in Scotland. This was the year 1757, when sailors led a very hard life on their ships at sea. Alan peered ahead into the whitish mist. These were iceberg seas, and he had to keep a sharp lookout. Now and again he would catch an angry word from far below as the captain and mate continued their argument. The captain's bullying voice made Alan think of Crab McAfee, an old retired sailor who used to spend hours talking to Alan about life in the British Royal Navy. Crab had gone in the Royal Navy when he was only 12. Once Crab told Alan about the bullying midshipman on one of the men-of-war who used to stand on the yardam and stamp on the fingers of young boys as they climbed to his level. One day, the midshipman fell, and his fall was seen by a dozen boys aloft in the rigging. They swung their hats and cheered the body all the way down to the deck. The doomed midshipman hit with such force that his leg bones were driven up into his body. For a moment, Alan imagined the short, squat body of Captain Hughes falling from the mainmast, turning over and over in the air before it hit the deck. It was one way to get rid of a hated sea captain, but unfortunately Captain Hughes never climbed up into the rigging. Through the still and windless air, Alan heard the 2 men arguing below him. "I don't like this fog rolling in," the captain shouted. "Aye, we're paying now for your stubbornness," Big Tom answered. "Oh, we'll come out of it," the captain said. "I've sailed through worse than this. It's late in the season and we're still far to the north. We should have come about a week ago." The captain said nothing. For the past week, the first mate had been insisting that they begin the long voyage home to Scotland. Their whaling ship, the Ann Forbes, had spent the summer between the north of Greenland and Spitsbergen, along the edge of the polar ice cap, chasing whales. Early in the season, the ship had fallen in with a large school of whales that the captain had followed to the north, sailing ever deeper into the Arctic seas. Big Tom, an experienced whaler, kept urging the captain to turn about. He had never seen the sea that clear of ice so far to the north before, and he knew how suddenly treacherous the polar seas could become. Many a whaling ship had been caught in the ice and never heard of again. But Captain Hughes was a stubborn man, and a greedy man, and he kept sailing north until the holds were almost full. Then one day, just after the whaleboat crew had lashed yet another whale to the ship's side, the captain suddenly grew alarmed. He ordered the fires under the trypots put out and the huge iron kettles lashed down. It was time to run for home. The last whale was hauled up on the deck, and for the next day or two, as the Anne Forbes was underway, the men cut the whale up into chunks of blubber that were packed away into barrels. The blubber from that last whale could almost always be melted down when the ship reached port. But several days after hoisting sail, Anne Forbes caught a northward current and made very little headway. Even worse, the polar seas were beginning to freeze over. Soon the vessel was surrounded by bobbing ice floes that every day grew more thick and numerous. To add to their troubles, a heavy fog lay over the water. The mate guessed that the fog meant the nearby presence of an iceberg or large ice field. He had seen those Arctic fogs before. He knew too that whaling ships were sometimes trapped in the ice all winter, and when that happened, the crews of such ships usually died from the cold, or from hunger, or from the dread sickness known as scurvy. And those were slow and painful ways to die, with none of the swift mercy of drowning. Now the ice floes were closing in on all sides of the Anne Forbes. Even Alan Gordon, high up on his lookout platform on the main mast, could hear the scrape of ice against the wooden sides of the vessel. Alan peered into the fog. On all sides he could spot cakes of ice bobbing past. As far as he could see, the water was dotted with ice floes of all shapes and sizes. Several times he spotted a large ice island, where dozens of floes had frozen to each other. But Alan was not worried. This was his first whaling trip into the northern seas, and he did not realize the danger. High up on the mast he thought only of his return home. With fair sailing weather, they could make it back to Scotland in a couple of weeks. It had been a good voyage, their holds were full, and Alan would make more money from this one trip than he had in 3 years of fishing. His mother would be pleased. Alan's father was dead, and they needed the money at home. He would also be able to buy a nice present for his girlfriend Nancy. Despite the cold and fog and ice, Alan was happy to be a whaler. He was in excellent health, made good money at an adventurous job, and he had already travelled more and seen more sights than most people did in a lifetime. What 17-year-old lad could ask for more? Alan had signed on the Anne Forbes 4 months before, entitled to a full seaman's share of the profits from the voyage. In those days, a seaman could make more money from whaling than any other kind of sea duty. The work was hard and dangerous, but it paid very well. Whale oil was in great demand. Before the discovery of crude oil, people burned whale oil in their lamps. Whalebone was used in ladies' garments, while perfume and cosmetics were made from other parts of the whale. Although Alan was only 17, he had already worked 3 years on fishing ships in his home port of Aberdeen. In those days, it was common for 12, 13 and 14-year-old boys to go to sea. Alan had worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for a tailor in Scotland before he went to sea, so he was well used to hard work. He was a strong, well-built youth who stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 160 pounds. He had blue eyes and straw-coloured hair and a tiny cleft in the point of his chin. Around Alan the canvas sails flapped lazily in the odd breeze the ship caught. As usual with fog, there was little wind and the ship was making slow headway. Suddenly Alan came alert. For a moment he thought he spotted land ahead. He knew that Anne Forbes was not far from the North Greenland coast, and it was possible that an uncharted island lay in the vessel's path. He lowered his head and narrowed his eyes as he tried to peer through the fog, but he could make out nothing. The afternoon light was failing and it was hard to see ahead for any distance. But there, now it loomed in front of him, a solid greenish-white wall of ice. He turned and shouted down with all his might, "Berg! Dead ahead! Berg! Dead ahead!" Down below, Captain Hughes yelled a command to the helmsman. "Hard a port! Blast your clumsy claws! Hard a port! Port! Port!" The Anne Forbes slowly began a turn to port. But it was too late. The ship hit the ice almost head-on. A heavy, smashing blow. Both mate and captain were thrown to the deck. The crash whipped the top of the mast forward like the tip of a fishing rod, and Alan flew from his lookout post. He hit a sail below and clutched at it desperately, but his mittened fingers could not get a grip. He half slid, half fell down the sail until he hit a spar. The blow knocked the breath from him, but he had sense enough to hook one arm under a rope and hang on. After several moments of just hanging there, he managed to pull himself up and onto the yardam. Then he looked down. Spars were snapping off with such fury that they sounded like gunshots. Sails hung sideways, all fouled in the rigging. Already one mast had crashed onto the deck. Alan picked his way to the very end of the yardam. There, some 20 feet below, was the flat surface of a ledge on the iceberg. Between the wreckage of the crippled ship and the smooth, hard surface of the ice, Alan chose the ice and dropped from the end of the yardam. This time the force of the fall knocked him out. On board the Ann Forbes, all was confusion. The ice wall against which the ship was pinned gave no foothold to anyone. The ship had started to sink, and an attempt was being made to lower one of the whaleboats on the sea side of the vessel. The whaleboat no sooner reached the water when a large ice floe smashed it to pieces against the side of the Ann Forbes. Bodies spilled into the sea. Other ice floes began to build against the seaward side of the ship. As the Ann Forbes settled lower in the water, large blocks of ice rode in over the side, forcing the vessel to list even more until the seawater came pouring in over her gunwales. All the sailors were now up on deck, desperately trying to save themselves. Some threw hatch covers into the sea and jumped in after them, hoping to use them as rafts. Quite a few had climbed the rigging, but with the tilt of the ship to seaward, they had no hope of reaching the top of the ice wall and were now simply hanging on to ropes and spars. Captain Hughes had gone down to his cabin to snatch up the ship's log and other valuable papers. Big Tom, bracing himself against the slope of the deck, looked around at all the others. There was a slight smile on his face. The desperate efforts, the panic, the scurrying to and fro, the captain trying to save the log, all of this seemed senseless to the mate, for he knew too much, knew they were all doomed, knew that the men who had jumped overboard would only last minutes in the freezing water, knew it was only a matter of time before the Arctic claimed another 50 victims. He looked up in the rigging, wondering what had happened to Alan Gordon. He felt a wave of pity for the 17-year-old youth out on his first voyage. Alan was nowhere to be seen, and the mate decided that he must have been thrown into the water and was no doubt drowned by now. "Get it over with," Big Tom muttered to himself, and ran down the sloping deck and dived cleanly over the rail to his death in the icy waters. Above, on the ice field, Alan Gordon groaned and forced himself to sit up. He was just in time to see the top of the ship's mast disappear from sight. The Ann Forbes had gone down in minutes, with all hands, and Alan was alone on a field of ice somewhere off the coast of Greenland, with no food, no water, and no hope of rescue. Alan looked around. Nearby there were some dim white shapes that he knew to be ice boulders, but they were the only things to be seen. Everywhere he looked there was fog and ice and piercing cold. He felt a desperate loneliness, as though he were the only person in the whole world. Without food, without water, and with no way of keeping warm, he was doomed. Death would come in a matter of days, perhaps even hours. It was so unfair, he thought. In one moment he was a happy young man on his way home to his family and girlfriend, with plenty of money honestly earned, and in the next minute he was sitting all alone on a piece of ice in the middle of the Arctic seas, waiting for death to come. He got to his feet, staggered over to one of the ice boulders and sank down behind it, trying to find some shelter from the cold. He wrapped his arms around his sides, hugging himself, and began to sway back and forth. "I'm going to die," he said aloud. I'm going to die right here, all alone, and no one will ever know about it. He thought then of his mother and of his 3 younger sisters, Jean, Flora, and Gladys. They would wait for word of the Ann Forbes, and as the months and then the years passed, they would learn to accept the fact that Alan was dead, and wee Bunty Duff would finally be right about Alan. However, if the schoolmaster were right, then the old fortune teller had to be wrong. Thinking of his mother, Alan reached a hand into his pocket and took out the Bible. There was just enough light to read his daily page. When he was finished reading, he carefully marked his place in the Bible with a thin, flat piece of whalebone that he used as a bookmark, then put the book away in his pocket and thought that in his present situation, saying a prayer was about the only possible way he could help himself. But he had little faith that prayer would save him either. Squinching down into his clothes as much as possible to keep warm, he sat there and waited for the end. That's the end of chapter 1. Hope you've enjoyed it. Good night.